Hi everyone, you're welcome to African Researchers Network. Um, we are a group of scholars in interaction with all other scholars irrespective of where they are across the world and interdisciplinary group. We have membership across various countries as well as early and late career scholars. And our objective is basically to enhance collaboration and networking and to also discuss future and ongoing publication and to also share this experience with scholars of African roots and scholars who are working on issues that has to do with Africa. And we have events monthly webinar, and you can always access that through our website, which are always documented on the YouTube channels. And then we also have monthly newsletters, which you can always get a copy and subscribe to the homepage of our website. And the newsletter, they are outputs of the monthly webinar, and we always try to so that people can also have reference to discussions that has been made through the network. They can be able to make reference to that in their publications and their papers. So we always ensure that we get that documented. And currently we have members coming in from almost various institutions, and we have over 100 registered members, and we are planning working earnestly on our journal, which is coming soon. And today's event, welcome to today's event, which is a very unique one, and according to the advert, the publicity, we said this is going to be one of the series of discussion along that same topic. And we welcome to today's discussion Dr. Freter, Abass, Isiaka, and also myself, Austin Farrella, as a host, and having Yokiam Tabari as a host. So at this point, to start with the first presentation, I'm going to hand over the virtual mic to Yokiam. Thank you.
Good morning, bonjour, sanunku. I hope you all are doing well wherever you are. It's good to have you all here this early. And I'm going to now do the introduction so that we can get ahead, to our program today. So I'm going to start with Dr. Yvette Freter. She was raised in South Africa, and she was educated in South Africa. And she currently teaches, she's a full-time educator, teacher, and she's also a researcher. And part of her research is she has received her master's degree in cultural studies in education and doctorate in learning environmental environments and educational studies from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. She teaches philosophy of education and history of education courses at the University of Tennessee and Tennessee Technological University. And as I mentioned, she's a full-time teacher also, and some of the areas of interest that she also include in her work is positionality, pedagogy, philosophy of education, and post-colonial issues in relation to equitable educational outcomes for students. And we look forward to hearing from you, Dr. Yvette, and thank you for being here, and thank you all for being here.
So great to be with you guys. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. And it is exciting to be part of such an amazing organization. I'm so grateful that I am able to present here. Of course, I feel as a white African, it's very gracious to be invited to an African organization. I always want to put that out there in the front that I am a Euro-Western trained educator that is seeking to find a way forward in a post-colonial context. And I do this sometimes with success and sometimes with failure, but always with a heart that seeks to be part of the solutions for Africa and not part of perpetuating the traumas of the past. So with that caveat, I want to talk about today the educational reform of higher education from a philosophical perspective. And I'm drawing from a chapter that my partner Bjorn and I wrote for Siseko Kumalo's book, Decolonization as Democratization, Global Insights of the South African Experience. And we did a study that was both conceptual and then also really a work of praxis, where we tried to think of ways, from my perspective as an educator, how to truly enact an ethical epistemological approach in African higher education. So the main issue that we looked at is we did a anecdotal survey of universities, and it showed mostly uniformly an adherence to the traditional Euro-Western philosophical canon in their undergraduate courses. And of course, that suggested that if the material is from the canon of the Euro-Western canon, and if the practitioners of teaching that are also white, and not only white, but male, there is no way, even if you want to seek equality in a philosophical department, that you can go forward with that, because your curriculum is Euro-Western influence and it's taught by predominantly Euro-Western white men. And so implicitly, this is stating that this idea of equality is impossible, because the standard is a Euro-Western white male perspective. So we need to embrace an ethical epistemological approach in African higher education that enacts a responsive and revitalizing decolonial practice. And let me tell you a little bit how that might look, because for those that are teaching in academia, there are so many demands. There's a political things to work through, there's a workload, there's grading, there's a research agenda. And now to challenge both our white and indigenous educators to now add a layer on to their approach as philosophers and philosophical educators, there are practical steps that we can take. And this is important because lack of representation is causing an increasing disconnect for students who do not see themselves represented in the curriculum and experience a perpetuation of privileged status quo for those who do. We have only to think of Rhodes Must Fall, for example, in the South African context. However, we argue that once educators are aware of their own positionalities as raced, classed, and gendered, they can begin to develop the skill set needed to engage their students in a culturally competent way. By purposely engaging the entire teaching force, and by this I mean both indigenous and Euro-Western ethnicities, in a process of desuperiorization, teachers can be guided in an understanding regarding the voices in the philosophical canon whose racism, sexism, and classism have explicitly or inadvertently oppressed or indoctrinated students. Now, desuperiorization is a concept that Yvette Freter has come up with, and it is this idea of the hierarchies that we have created and that are there, are socially constructed, but also we are thus able to unwanted them. And we have to let go of that superiorization in some instances and overcome the desuperiorization in other instances. And so knowing and being aware of how race and class and gender creates a sort of a hierarchy in our social world and a construction that we have made for ourselves, that can then also be undone. We can unwant that, we can deconstruct that. And so one of the solutions is working in curriculum and pedagogy. So personal transformation of teachers, this desuperiorization, this awareness needs to result in the utilizing of revitalization of curriculum and pedagogies to make structural changes. So critical multicultural scholars have long told us that this is vital for so-called diverse students who have to suffer from negative racial attitudes, actions, and events perpetuated by schools and societies, not because of any specific behaviors they exhibit, but simply because of who they are. So curriculum pertains to the texts that we select, and pedagogies looks at how, as educators, we structure our class, how we position ourselves as teachers and where we see students, the assignments we assign, the assessments that we provide, the way that we consider knowledge to be either to be socially constructed and therefore everybody has a contribution, or if we see ourselves as the conduit of great information and we know it all and we're passing it on to the empty vessels of our students. So clearly what we teach and how we teach is going to have a either a perpetuation of a colonial mindset, whether it's intentional or not, or it's going to be part of this process of desuperiorizing ourselves and including others. So the roots of inequality and privilege, to address these roots, a paradigm shift is needed for all teachers. They need to see themselves as social reconstructivists, naming neglected histories and ways of being and thinking, and exposing superiorism in all its forms. Now, this is a change, right? If we just think of ourselves as we are just passing on content, there is so much more to this, that we are actually trying to make society better through our teaching. And we have to name neglected histories and ways of being and thinking and expose the superiorism in these acts of being social reconstructivists. Teachers need to understand that they're carriers of their very own social normative self-understanding, our hidden curriculum. And colorblind racism or overt racism cannot be part of our practice as teachers. This is very important because often I think we would like to draw a line in the sand and say that that was apartheid and it's done. And now let's move forward. That is still racism. It is a colorblind racism that presumes that race does not matter anymore. And that is simply for those that decide that they want to progress in the meritocracy, or those that are already in the meritocracy and want to just keep moving on with the privileges that they have and simply say, I don't see race. Whereas anyone who is raised can certainly attest to the fact that race is very much an issue in their educational experience. So teachers will have to acknowledge that at this point in our post-apartheid society, we still cannot escape the bounds of race, class, and gender, and that it is necessary to unpack one's positionality to further the goals of educational equality and relevance. The members of the dominant culture, and in the case of South Africa, this has historically been Euro-Westerners, must become allies and use their influence to trouble collective positions of privilege, to identify actions we can take to share power with non-white people, and to engage in dialogue and coalition building. This will require Euro-Western influenced educators to learn to step aside, listen, share, find ways to connect in meaningful ways with their non-Euro-Western students, and be students of culture and alternative pedagogies. So Euro-Western influenced educators need to engage in serious personal reflection in order to address the disconnect between liberal ideologies that support equality in education in theory, but in practice lead to self-interested educational choices. Now, I'm going to be quite frank. There is a phenomena. There are many, many good white people who want good things for their students. However, that is not enough. As Ivan Illich says, to hell with good intentions, okay? So we cannot have an idea of liberal ideology and yet perpetuate the status quo. Those two things cannot exist together. You cannot claim to want the good, but not work to enact the good. A great example of this. I'm sorry? Okay. A great example of this is Thomas Jefferson. So teachers have to confront their own ideologies that have allowed them to bridge desperate streams of thought and solve the dissonance that results from the contradiction between their desired liberal identity and class, race, gender, positionality. Prevailing attitudes demonstrate that many Euro-Western people still believe that just injustice can be rectified without altering their own status. We must unwind our colonial inheritance, or it will keep influencing our minds and actions. So positionality, which again is our race, class, gender, comes into play when teachers' attitudes and values and knowledge are seen as factors in student success. Teachers are not a neutral factor. They're not just conduits of information. They, in fact, are a curriculum in and of themselves. Teacher temperament, disposition, tolerance, flexibility, high expectations, caring, appreciation of communities and cultures are vital elements in school success for Indigenous youth. Teachers need to be interested in their students' lives and authentically care for their students and expect the best from them. This will challenge the teacher to study different epistemologies and will hence lead to critical multicultural pedagogies, an adaptation of the curriculum, and a critique of Euro-Western normativity and structural inequality in a conscious move to engage students who have become disenchanted with their educational institutions and who seek solutions to the challenges of their time. Right? We need to make education bring the student into the classroom, their knowledge base, their experiences, and also make philosophy and whatever our discipline is apply to the lives that they are living now and the challenges that they face in their context. So as we seek a balanced curriculum, we suggest as long as undergraduate students are not exposed to African scholarship in their curriculum, they will not become the graduate students and researchers that do the important work of reclamation and original philosophy that needs to and should happen in Africa. As long as undergraduate students are exposed to Euro-Western scholarship in a way that renders this Euro-Western tradition as the only tradition of significance, all non-Euro-Western scholarship will be introduced to them as inferior, merely exotic, and ultimately useless. So we have this dichotomy set up, that there is African philosophy that is maybe included in a course called African philosophy, but then that's part of the bigger philosophy, which is Euro-Western, but it is ubiquitous. It is taken as the base of all knowledge. And then African work is just sort of an additive. And the problem is, we want to both end. We don't want to just go Afrocentric, but we want to apply Euro-Western philosophy in as much as it helps the African student in an African context. And where the two are seen as equally valuable, it is not throwing out, and it is also not a romanticizing of African scholarship. It is as difficult as and open to critique as Euro-Western scholarship is, but both need to be on the table. And so we suggest a both and approach that values African contributions while utilizing Euro-Western philosophy based on contextualized African needs. So I know I've said a lot and there's so much to unpack, but what I would rather like to do is conclude and then make sure that there is a lot of time for us to discuss. Maybe something has sparked and we can go into greater depth. So in a conclusion, what I have proposed along with Bjorn is that embracing an ethical epistemological approach in African higher education begins with the need for philosophy departments to consider the full influence of Euro-Western philosophy in decolonial educative contexts. We urge philosophical practitioners in higher education contexts to enact a responsive decolonial practice by initiating an understanding of one's positionality and a desuperiorizing outlook. It is our contention that through reflection on one's epistemological stance and the embracing of culturally responsive pedagogies and a more balanced Afro-realistic curriculum, an education system can be fostered that is actively decolonial and positively working towards creating African philosophers and change agents within the faculty and student populations of higher education institutions. So thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to discussing this in greater depth with you guys.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Dr. Vet. This is so interesting, and I'm so happy because I'm a philosophy student, and in Africa I was, and when your presentation focused so much on philosophy education, and with a call for equality, for interactivity between various parts of the world, and for the idea that collaboration and allies will go a long way to also ensure this kind of contextual as well as positionality in the education system. And it's so interesting because when I received my own education, for instance, in philosophy, first and second degree, in Nigeria, a country in Africa, right? And the bulk of the work was so much 80% on Western philosophy. And so when you highlighted the fact that the colonization and as well as intercollaboration brings a holistic formation, and you also drew knowledge and experience from your experience, from your on-ground experience in South Africa. So the conversation will continue. We're going to have all the participants asking the questions, dropping it in the chat or raising it up during when we're going to have open the floor. But for the meantime, I can see Tahir hand is up. You want to say something, but you're going to say something, you can drop it in the chat, or by the time we take the second presenter, you're going to take, we're going to allow you to speak to the matter and also and talk directly with the speaker. So I think Yokiam, you can bring in the next speaker if you're okay with that.
So our next speaker, okay. So, pardon me. I don't know whether you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Pardon me. So let's have Tamer say their point, and then I'll go and introduce Brother Abass. Is that okay?
Okay, let me allow him to unmute himself. So Tamer.
Okay, or we can just, we can
okay,
just,
yeah.
Yeah.
So Tahir, you
yes.
can speak to your question.
Yes. Thank you, sir. All my friends and colleagues who are from Africa and all other countries. My name is Tahir. I'm from Ethiopia. I'm very, very glad to be here and to participate this, very, very interesting issue about the institutional transformation, especially in Africa. As you know, Africa, the people, what they are saying and what's at the ground level in Africa is different. Africa is a country of, naturally transformed from different, what we call it, technologies. And what we need is, as you know, in order to have a local transformation, also regionally, what we need is, okay, thank you, I understand. So what we need is, we have to have what we call it regional integration systems, and also we have to empower our what we call it institutional sectors, especially what we call the universities, and also in the other areas, especially we have to focus what we call it the technological transformation in education and also other sectors. So in my colleagues, what I am empowering now is, and what I am suggesting from a comment is, what we need is, in order to have a great and what we call a success transformation in different trends in Africa, what we need is we have what we call it interaction in different cultures, in different African countries and peoples, to have a good interaction. And also not on beside also Africa, we have to have a good interaction. So my question is, this session should not be at last. We should continue our efforts that we have to build and to empower of our people of African countries to have what we call it a sophisticated manners or mechanisms that we can empower our people of African country. So what I am suggesting, and also here is
We've lost him. I think you have been able to get some of the major points he's raising, but I think we're going to continue with that later. So I'm going to mute him, and we're going to take the second presenter and then open the panel for further discussion. So please, you can introduce Abass.
Yes, and thank you so much, Dr. Freter, for that great presentation. I have several questions, and I hope the audience do too. So I'm gonna introduce a PhD student, Abass Isiaka. He's a PhD researcher at on education policy, public policy that is, in Equity, University of East Anglia, and his work will focus on education policies in Africa. Good to have you, brother. The floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. I'm not going to share my screen. Okay. Good day, everyone, and thank you for coming. And I also want to appreciate Dr. Freter for your beautiful presentation about critical pedagogies to address the issue of equities in higher education. So in this presentation, I will be speaking to the following key issues, and I would like to talk a little bit about my research, and I want to speak to periodization of history and the invention of Africa, and I will look at the roles of the university as an institution in Africa, and offer some concluding thoughts about institutional transformation. So to begin with, in the last few months, I've been working as a researcher on the intersection of institutional culture and the policy of inclusion in higher education institutions in Nigeria, using the perspective of students with disabilities. So if you look at the picture on the left, you will see that there's a signboard welcoming you to the university and showing where the road leads. And like every institutional narrative, the reality of the journey is not that linear as it's being depicted on the board. So I'm interested in the problematics between what the institution is saying, what are the institutional ideologies, and what happens in reality to the experience of students that are entering the university. So on the issue of periodization, historians have used periodization as a methodology in understanding how events occurred in history, how institutions have changed. And in addressing institutional transformation that has an element of change, I think we need to consider the method we use to research transformation. The invention of Africa, as eloquently revisited by Mudimbe in 1988, questions whether we should continue to periodize our history with a colonial reference, or we should deconstruct the tools or gnosis used in writing about Africa. For me, I think institutional transformation means a profound change within an institution and consequently leading to specific working results. Before the scramble for Africa in 1885, for centuries, several centuries, we know that Africa had renowned universities such as the Qarawiyyin in Fes, Morocco, the Al-Azhar University in Cairo, and which is considered even to this moment as the oldest continuously operating university in the world. We have Sankore in Timbuktu of today's Mali from the 12th century. So this means that African people had their own valid and legitimate indigenous system of education prior to colonization. So, however, the dawn and the unfolding of the Eurocentric modernity through colonialism and imperialism unleashed a particularly racial ethnocentric attitude that led European colonialists to question the very humanity of African people, as we've seen in the work of Achille Mbembe on the post-colony. So this questioning and sometimes outright denial of African people's humanity inevitably enabled not only the genocides, but what Boaventura de Sousa Santos refers to as epistemicides, and also what Ngugi wa Thiong'o was theorizing as linguicides in his decolonizing the mind, and also cultural imperialism, as we've seen in the works of Ali Mazrui and Edward Said. So going forward, scholars like Mahmoud Mamdani, Achille Mbembe, Falola, Aro Shagbe, Chino Achebe, and Lofu Gatsheni, these scholars have addressed specific questions of African universities' role in Africa's development. And in this talk, I will be analyzing our education system as an institution by looking at the three missions of the university, that is teaching, research, and service. At the same time, it is important to note that it is not possible to address Africa entirely within this talk. So I think it would be foolhardy to try and assume or presume an expert on this vast continent. So now let's go to the skilling mission of the university. So Africa's knowledge production is structured by the dynamics and the nature of Africa's insertion into the modern, originally imperialist, now later neoliberal, and now globalizing Euro-American civilization, and the late colonial era and the first decades following independence witnessed the process of conscious responses to the need to indigenize the focus, orientation, and the methods of knowledge production on Africa. Schooling has become notional due to a crisis of relevance, and youth now regard higher education, or even education generally, as a scam due to the inability to relate education to success or social mobility as promised by the human capital and other development theories that we had post-independence. So with the implementation of the structural adjustment policies in the 80s, the sudden problem of graduate employability called the relevance of inherited curricula into question. And furthermore, reductions in student support combined in some cases with the introduction of fees raised awareness among families about the unequal value for money and even stratifying the society furthermore. As families now need to spend more money on university education. So all of these resulted in the establishment and expansion of pre-degree, postgraduate, professionally oriented courses in our public universities. The financial constraints of the 1980s, as orchestrated by the World Bank provisions on our education, implied that a portion of urban middle class population whose children had previously completed their studies abroad would now have to plan for entirely local tertiary education. So evidence also suggests that far from creating democratic society and nurturing equitable and peaceful relationship, schooling equally has the potential to nurture conflict, encourage gender violence, and reinforce racial prejudice, as we've seen in Dr. Freter's presentation, and even sustain social inequalities. Going forward, I would like to talk to research as a mission of the university. And to catch up with the demands of the global knowledge economy, Africa would need 1 million PhDs, says a report by Coates. And in the study by Musbah and Gingras in 2019, they analyzed the global trends in knowledge production, which covers articles published in more than 1,000 journals in the discipline of social sciences. And this study confirmed that Africa produces about 2% of the world research output. So perhaps I can be able to further explain this in another study by Jonathan Adams and his colleagues in 2013, giving us a breakdown of figures to demonstrate the extent to which each region in Africa or Africa size as a whole is dominated by 3 nations, Egypt in the north with about 58 publications, Nigeria in the middle with about 20,000 publications, and South Africa in the south, as expected, with about 95,000 since 2000. So, and this, if you look at this touring countries in terms of publication, that could explain why the QS ranking that came out about a few weeks ago, having about 35 universities in Africa being ranked, and majority of these universities are situated in Egypt and South Africa. So this could explain the reasons why we have this stratification amongst institutions in Africa. So the next thing I would like to speak to, okay, the next thing I would like to speak to is the question we should be asking, and that would be, how did major universities on the Africa continent, once known as significant hubs for excellent research in the post-colonial period, become so reductive in the 1990s? And how did it turn around in many of them, such as Ibadan, Makerere, Dar es Salaam, scrape out their fundamental role as centers of knowledge production rather than transmission of a second-hand knowledge from Europe? So the literature on academic mobility in the realm of brain drain that we saw in the 90s, that crippled institutions in Africa, recently the discourse in mobility is shifting from brain drain to brain circulation, as we now have advancement in information and communication technologies, which are now making significantly easier for migrants, for instance, myself, in diasporas, to engage more actively in matters in their own countries. So according to a report, a UNESCO report, The Race Against Time for Smarter Development, this report shows that low spending on scientific research remains pervasive in Africa, and all countries on the continent were among the 80% of countries worldwide that invested less than 1% of GDP in scientific research. And if you want to know how important this investment is, you can check China and how it's competing with the US in funding globally. So all countries on the continent, so Africa's share of the global expenditure on research and development remained constant at 1.01 between 2014 to 2018. But in sub-Saharan Africa, it has dropped from 0.44 to 0.42. So Nigeria, for instance, does not have a national organization dedicated to research funding. And instead, we have the National Research Fund being managed by the Tertiary Education Trust Fund, TET Fund, which is a government-controlled foundation whose work is primarily focused on tertiary education. So studies have revealed that this kind of arrangement that we have in Nigeria creates limited funding for research, no clear research funding priority areas, no research evaluation activities, and ineligibility of private universities and research institutes in accessing this fund. So moving forward, I would like to speak to the nation building agenda of the university, and higher education institutions, particularly major public universities, have frequently served focal points for political debates, for critique, and at the same time mobilization for change. So in most parts of Africa, the public university has a dual status, according to Jan Lebo. So on the one hand, as a state-funded institution to a varying degree, also controlled by the state, is potentially part of the state's ideological apparatus, as well as the reproductive apparatus of the society. And in some cases, university lecturers, we've seen them being routinely called upon to participate in radio, television debates, and to speak on current events, to mobilize and to sensitize the people. So these, as well as the role of academics in national conferences held here and there, are facilitating the link between the gown and the town. So in 2011, Mahmoud Mamdani delivered a keynote address at the Makerere University, and he stated that 2 models of higher education have emerged in Africa. And the first is state-driven, and the second is market-driven. So in his word, state-led models tended to develop historically informed interdisciplinary curricula, whereas we have the market-led modules tended to introduce market-driven curriculum as expected. But the state-driven modules tend to undermine academic freedom, as we've seen in most universities around the continent, and thereby transforming universities into parastatals. Whereas we have market-driven modules emphasizing privatization, which fosters a culture of consultancy. Both models, in this case, have collectively failed to create a sustainable and equitable higher education program in Africa. So I'm going to make my conclusion here and to see what we can take forward in our further conversation. I would say finally that Africa's problem is that we must first win the intellectual war before engaging in physical combat against violence, underdevelopment, and poverty. People have written so well about this, and it won't happen by looking to the outside. Instead, it will begin with a persistent internal debate, which we have to constantly having as we progress in this phase of development. And Africa will not be able to pull itself out of this current situation unless we are able to win the war for epistemic decolonization. And Lofugat Sheni, in one of his works, wrote about the failure to deliver epistemic decolonization in the 90s, where we have these nationalists trying to politically decolonize Africa or even their countries, but they failed to achieve the Africanization or the decolonization of our epistemologies, and that led to where we are today. So we need to win the war for epistemic decolonization, and Africa's success is predicated on our capacity to seize control of the field of inquiry by posing some paradigmatic questions. I mean, questions that are able to change the way we think and the way we debate issues that are significant to Africans, that are indigenous to them, and are rooted in our own experiences. And just to finally to say that we need to build a national research strategies and give our universities more autonomy and resources to lead innovations, so that we can be able to get our place or be able to situate it in a very strong position amongst the Committee of Nations. Thank you, and I'll be glad to take your questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Abass Bolaji, for your presentation. And people are clapping for you, and virtually or physically, but you can hear that. And it's so much awesome to have you here today. And I will just make a quick recap of your presentation. You started by trying to look at the idea of a university and what education is all about itself. And you traced that in Africa, talking about Western education, because you did acknowledge that there are other forms of education, and you trace it, which you tagged as colonial education, because it came from colonial framework and it has its own agenda or its own purpose. And you've been able to show from your presentation that what should be the ideal goal of education itself, which you itemize in your presentation, and you move further a little bit to what is on ground in our tertiary educational institution in Africa, and you talk about the publications, the ranking, as well as the question of standards within the globe, and you place institutions in Africa a kind of in the context of how it's being seen or viewed and evaluated by the world. And you also address the whole concept of washing down or low ranking based on standards, which has some level of inequalities too. And that has led to brain drain, in which you also talk about in your presentation in such a way that the downgrading of African institutions also led to that. And you also mentioned one important challenge is to decolonization, which is whether education is a priority to political leaders in Africa, or it's just one of those things. And we are referring to Western education. And you showed us an icon of a politician who was talking about education being the key, and saying, no, I was a child when I actually said that. Sorry, it's not the main thing now, because the goal of education seems to have been lost along the line. And you concluded by trying to raise that the ideal form of decolonization and the effort that has been made deliberately to also frustrate decolonization in the concept of saying this was education that was brought to Africa. This was the purpose of the reason for those education, but people is like this, a kind of invisible revolt that is being seen. Like, we don't want to learn things that are not going to add to our values. We don't want to learn certain standards, that we have to learn things about other parts of the world except about things that concerns us. And we are to learn how things are wrong about us rather than learning things on how to move forward. But you have shown how that has been frustrated technically through what we can say the politics of publication, as well as the ongoing brain drain. This is awesome and wonderful, and we know that this will open door for conversation. So I'm going to hand over the microphone, the virtual microphone, to Yokiam to pilot this conversation, as many people are already ready to tap into the discussion. So Yokiam, please take the virtual mic. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Abass, for this fantastic presentation. You hit a lot of points that I think are very important that we need to discuss. Right now, I just would like to bring, if anyone has a question, you can raise your hand and point out, or, okay, I think you can hear me. If anyone has a question, you can ask now or make a comment. You can actually ask both for Dr. Freter and Abass.
Freter has a hand up.
Okay, yes, please. I didn't see it. Yes, you
Oh,
may.
no, thank you. So, this is for Abass particularly, but all of us, I think, in this conference, in this space right now. Abass, it was amazing what you talked about and the systemic things that you brought up in terms of, is the university there for the state? Is it there for industry? Is it there for, making the world a better place? And so many vital things that needs great scholars to be there and people to work hard. So my question speaks to the issue of the diaspora and the brain drain. I don't want to go back. I'll be honest. I really like the quality of life I have in America. What do you feel is our responsibility as we talk about these issues and study these issues to return to the continent, to do this work, this amazing work of like what Abass has shown us, the structural work that needs to be done to promote a place in academia where thinking can be done and research can be done. What do you guys think?
Nice question. I think Abass should take the lead as a guest speaker, because you are in the UK and you are receiving you are also studying to have your PhD just in a few years, or I can call it months. And the question she's asking now is also fundamental. Should we go back to actually make this impact, or to reflect the changes that we desire?
Thank you, Dr. Freter, and thank you, Augustine. I think in a session last week or two, I was asked the same question about, okay, what's your plan returning to Africa, and what do you like to do, and all of that. So I think I believe in what some people have been theorizing about brain circulation, and the fact that there is possibility of cross-pollination of ideas, diasporas, and we can actually make change wherever we are. We can you can be socially located somewhere else and be epistemically located in another environment. So it depends on how you situate your location. So some people might be in Africa and actually be working for the West or to the West or to the advantage of the West, especially the way we see most African universities. Okay, Ndlovu was making an argument about the fact that African universities are not African universities. They were instrument of the West for the West. And that is why it was very easy for people to say migrate from Africa to Europe or America, and it requires little adaptation for them to fit in, because the way of their thinking, or say the cosmologies or their epistemologies were Eurocentric right from time. So coming, it's like, okay, you're now back to the roots. So which was just something that I was trying to address in some of those conversations I've had in the past about moving, about this migration and the geopolitics of knowledge, as I was saying. But Africa needs intellectuals, and Africa has intellectuals. But we see people living every day because of some issues I've addressed about lack of autonomy and the clamping of political elites on the institution, turning the institution to be parastatals and trying to use most institutions for their own gain. So if we are able to address systemically the importance of the university in driving development, in driving change, and academics are being given what they desire, I'm very sure so many people are ready to say, go back and make these changes. I mean, in close contact, because yeah. I've seen scholars in Codesria working remotely, and they are making significant impact in their own countries. Falola, for instance, Tony Falola is in Texas, and he has a wide range of collaboration with scholars in Africa at UI or Bafemi University. So these are examples of these collaborations, especially now that we are now better connected, or we've seen the benefit, a slice of the fourth industrial revolution, changing the way we make impact, changing the way we connect, the way we transform or even transfer our knowledges. So that's just one thing I would say, that if you are actually committed, it is not impossible to make change wherever you are in the world. So
that's awesome. That's awesome. And if I were to contribute a little bit to that, we within the past 4 or 5 years, we have seen a lot of mentorship coming out, scholars of African origin from the UK, from the US, coming to various universities across Africa, and establishing that link for mentorship. We have Lagos Studies Association, founded by a lot of scholars who are of Nigerian origin, who are in the US. And I was a beneficiary of that, because they found the need that they need to connect the effort that is being made by African scholars in producing great younger scholars. They need to connect them to the globe and also bring their work. And that's what we are also doing, the main purpose behind this African Researchers Network. I can remember when people were talking about brain drain, I argued personally for brain gain, because we are talking about this Western education, and there is nothing wrong with Western education, because we know the origin of Western education. Western education started in a monastery in the 15th century. And we understand with people like Thomas Aquinas and all others who are coming up with some of all this, which other people come from all other parts of Europe and other places to even partake. And then the essence and the development, which has its own goal towards people understanding themselves, understanding their place in the world, as well as giving to the society, making that impact to reflect in other forms of institution within the society. But where people are making efforts within this global framework, are making efforts in other parts of the world, other worlds, and they are being rated based on the resources that are not even available to them. So we talk about rating of Nigerian universities or some of the African universities
using whether they have internet or their websites are up to standard, and downgrading this whole effort, it projects them in a very inferiority light, which is a form of discrimination, and that is also reflecting also in publication, in which I schooling in Africa, in Nigeria, for instance, and a lot of wonderful lecturers who are Nigerians and who are published, but their work is not surfacing anywhere. Is not so much reflected and is not entering that global canon. And this has been most of all this other effort that is coming towards this talk about institutional transformation. The problem with decolonization is not to say there is problem with Western education, because the whole idea of what we call Western or colonial education is not the product of a particular region. So we can see the Library of Alexandria and the wealth of knowledge there. We can see how the history of education revolves around to the Arab, to the Islamic education, to all forms. So what we are talking about is not about people saying, go back. A lot of people used to say that when we make something like this, when are you going to go back and make that impact? Because as Abass has also said, when we trace the history of various departments and faculty, for instance, at the University of Lagos or Ibadan, we have faculty members from Europe who were coming to lecture in the 80s, in the 90s, and people are coming and they are being paid well before we have dictators and the military regime trying to also silence the voice of the people. Okay. So what we're talking about is the collective collaboration in enhancing this, rather than talking about the brain drain and when we're going to go back. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Thank you for that point. But I wanted to actually mention, maybe not to you, but to Abass, and also perhaps Dr. Freter could respond to that. You did mention that there's nothing wrong with Western education. So in a way, though, you are sort of in a way, you're against what this is based on my understanding of their presentations, that Dr. Freter and Dr. Abass, what they actually say, they're essentially saying that something is wrong with Western education, the way it's being produced or reproduced on the continent of Africa. So, and so there is something, even though you can say that there's an element of this education that we have, right, that started on the continent in ancient Africa. Now, the way it's been packaged and repackaged and sent to Africa, and Africans are using this model that of the European version of it. This is what, in my reading, the both presentation are critiquing. So in there, correct me if I'm wrong. This is what both of them say. There's something wrong, and we need to decolonize.
Let me make this clarification, because we are having these conversations as with presenters as well as all of us as part of the panel. The major issue at hand is what has been called Western or colonial education. Trace the origin and the roots. So we have Descartes, influencing David Hume. Descartes is a French philosopher or thinker. We have Thales, Anaximenes influencing other people. We have Thomas Aquinas, for instance, and all other people in the education that was existing before injecting colonial flavor into that was just simply education, was just knowledge circulating. And you can see arguments about the African origin of certain music, the African origin of certain epistemic framework that has been denied, so we are not saying there's a knowledge that belongs to a particular region of the world. And what I see with the decolonization effort is to return to remove elements of discrimination, racism, bias, and emphasis away from what has been the original, and such that ideas will not end up having color or having location. Because what we are saying is this: what Aristotle was saying at a particular point in time, Orunmila was saying it, or was saying it in Yoruba culture, and was saying the same thing. And then people begin to say, according to our people, but we ask them where are the references. And what we're talking about is this. I don't want to take the floor, but I still maintain that let's talk about whatever is called colonial or Western education is something flavored with that. Education is education, and let's return it to the root, which everyone has a voice in it, and it's not dominated. And that's what I feel is the coloniality. But John is here, and many other people, 4 hands are up, and I think maybe we can hear other voices. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's hear from, pardon me. Let me see who is up. Dr. Freter. Yes, you may go, Dr. Freter. Let me see.
You have to say which one.
I'm talking about the male,
Male version.
male version.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna say anything that's surprising, but I think this is a fairly important point. I think, from my perspective, the continuous problem is, of course, education is of highest importance, and I think there is no doubt that it is of grave importance to share knowledge and to share approaches, even if you do not agree to the approaches, just to learn about those. But the continuous problem is, and I guess especially, it must be especially visible for African scholars in the diaspora, is the continuation of a lack of understanding that there's also a Western side to the project of decolonization. So the problem is that the Western self-understanding of what the Western world and Western thought has produced, for example, in the phenomenon of colonialism, has not really been tied from a Western perspective with Western thought. So the continuous problem that we have, that Western scholars do have, because they continue to reject this insight, is that there's a connection between what they think and what has happened. The Western world tries to convey the rest, tries to convince the rest of the world that they are a moral authority and that the way of life that they present is the way to go, by completely neglecting the obvious fact that this way of life could only come to reality by literally subjugating the so-called rest of the world. And how can you recommend this way of life to anyone else? Because that would imply that anyone else also has to find someone to exploit. And on the one hand, that seems to be a fairly strange hierarchy of the world. And on the other hand, it seems to be in blatant conflict with the very core of Western moral self-understanding. And this Western moral self-understanding is prevailing within the philosophical departments. And there is no actual connection that while we invented the thoughts of enlightenment, we continue to sugar our coffee with slave harvested sugar. And the problem is that we do not know how deeply contaminated the liberal cores of Western thought are by this ability to accommodate and to live at peace with a blatant, openly dissonance between the moral that is presented and the moral that is actively lived, as Yvette pointed out multiple times. So when you're talking about what to do with this education, I think we have to be extremely careful. Even I, as a Western scholar, have to be extremely careful. And especially African scholars have to be extremely careful with that, because we do not know. How is it possible that at least since the height of the Enlightenment in Great Britain, in France, in Germany, and in the US, we have determined that racism and sexism, or as I like to address as superiorism, should not be, but it's still there. And there's only one reason for that. We pretend that it should be wrong, and we produce a way of lies that allows us to continue to harvest the fruits of racism and sexism and superiorism, while at the same time presenting ourselves to the world as the one moral authority. So, and if that is possible, it must be deeply hidden within our self-understanding. And I think it's blatantly obvious as for example, in the scholars of the Enlightenment, as we find it in Kant. In Kant, we have absolutely brutal disregard of other people, not only Black people, also women, old people, disabled people, homosexual people. They are all treated in a horrible way. And at the same time, he is considered as the foundational father of the ideas of autonomy, liberalism, freedom, democracy, and so on. And how is that done? And I think the most common way this is done is by calling the racism, I'm just have to think of, we have a beautiful word for that in German. The racist part in Kant's work is sort of, that's for the additional volumes of his work, if you really want to read it all, but they're not at the core of his work. The core of his work is the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, and on eternal peace and all these things. But all the racism, no, that's not relevant. And I think that is one, as ridiculously cheap this trick seems to be, but that's one of the major tricks. We convince ourselves that there is no problem with being a racist and a pseudo anti-racist couple at the same time. But from my point of view, there is. So one of the foundational problems, if the Western society was able to pull this trick off, to convince themselves that they're on the morally right side, I think we have to be extremely careful if we take these units of knowledge and just implant them into the African communities, because if they were able to sort of break our Western minds, probably they are still dangerous. And I'm not even saying that this is necessarily the truth. What I'm sort of trying to attack my white Western scholars with is, you don't even know that because you didn't check. You are so entitled that you didn't even try to check if Kant's racism continued to live in his idea, for example, of the equality of all human beings. And Yvette already put the example out of Thomas Jefferson, where it is much more visible. But he's another great example of these people who literally give little Black boys as Christmas gifts while writing that it is self-evident that we're all created equal. And if Western societies can pull that off for more than 200 years, I think we got to be very careful with what kind of knowledge we try to implement somewhere else, because a foundational principle of Western society is take everything you need and forget about the rest of the world. They just have to then follow our great example. And that's something that I sincerely would not recommend. Thank you.
That's great. That's great.
Yes, thank you for that, Dr. Freter. And I think part of it is there's also, I think from the Western context, as some of us that have been studying here and also study on the content, there's also an assumption from mainstream scholars. When I say mainstream, I mean, those, white scholars and Eurocentric scholars like that. There's this assumption or pretense that African scholars have autonomy. But generally speaking, the education on the continent, as highlighted by two of our speakers, they're deeply colonial. So, that there's an element of it that they're not acknowledging that colonialism happened. There's also the second element that they're not acknowledging the impact of colonialism, as highlighted by both of our speakers. To not say any further, I would like to hear, I think Dr. Jim wants to speak. And then after that, I'll let others.
Yeah, I think there's almost like two tracks of critical debate going on. And Bjorn, thank you very, very much for pointing out the pervasiveness of racism in the sort of post-colonial world. But what was interesting about Abass, what I got from Abass, and I found it very, very is inspiring, was that there's a further point, and we're talking about education, and there's also the further point beyond sort of racial aggression and domination within kind of the knowledge in higher education and thinking in higher education. The further point is that the institutions, looking at the institutions, you had this word parastatal, I think it was, or something like that, and then the business model. But beyond that, just the point that institutions are framed by an ideology, and what was great about Abass is where he was going. What I got was he was saying that, actually, hey, African countries or educational systems need to establish or need to flower, need to develop, need to imagine in their own African ideology. There's no requirement to. There is a requirement to actually go further in our critique of Africa and education and so on, and to the point of finding or using alternatives. So I thought that was very powerful, very powerful and very important. That point we need to, and it connects with what you're saying, Bjorn, in a way. It's that it's getting out of the thinking. It's hard to get out of these dominant paradigms in the world. But Abass was touching on the point that precisely the challenge for Africa is also one of getting out anyway, doubly so, perhaps. To escape exploitation, domination, but to escape something else. A possibility. There's a possibility. So that's what I'm saying here.
Thank you, Dr. Jim. Now I'll give the floor to Abass to address to address some of the questions and comments that have been highlighted, and then we'll go to Dr. Freter, the female Dr. Freter, and then we'll go to the next person whose hand is up. Thank you.
Thank you, Yaknam, and everyone that have made very valid points. And it's quite interesting to see how we are pushing this conversation and why we need to keep having this conversation. I would say that I'll just make my own comments. It's impossible to address this very provocative and challenging discussion we're having. So I would say that I want us to understand that knowledge is situated, and it is situated in the vessels conveying that knowledge. For instance, as a teacher, and your positionalities, as Dr. Freter mentioned in our presentation, matters. Your racial categorization or privileges or class or even ability or disability, these things matter, and they mediate, they shape the way we know and how we know, or even what we know. And I just want to make reference to the so-called Western philosophy or Western knowledge. And if you think around them, we know that these philosophies have been, say, developed around the Egito, the mind and the body dualism, and which say gave sort of background to what we now know as the Western philosophy. And before Descartes was making the reference to, I think, therefore I am, Ramon Grossfugger was saying that there have been about 150 years of I conquered, therefore I am, because these there have been knowledges before I think therefore I am that have been destroyed. We have the Andalusi in Spain. We have witches that were burned alive. We've had so many wars against epistemologies before we can now have I think therefore I am. So there was this kind of clearing that happened before what we now know as a canon. And we've seen people writing about the need for decolonization. If you look at sociology, for instance, Cornel Irwin was writing about the Southern theory or the Southern sociology. And in that case, was trying to make reference to the fact that there have been knowledges before this knowledge, but due to the coloniality of power or the geopolitics of knowledge, we now have a particular set of people being regarded as a foremost thinker in so many areas. People have written about Ibn Khaldun being one of the foremost thinkers in sociology before we have the common names that we have in sociology today. So this is just to say that, just to agree in some extent with Augustine that there have been knowledges, and it's just that there is this power that changed whose knowledge is being regarded as knowledge, or whose knowledge counts. And so that also emphasizes why we need to start thinking of how we can say transform the way we know, and start thinking say more endogenously from our own experience. Okay, let me just give an example of Marxism and how it became developed. We can trace Marxism or the work of Karl Marx and Hegel to ethnographies of people in Manchester before they were able to come up with their manifesto. So this is just to say that the knowledge is being situated with people, and we have to have this conversation. We have to go back to our roots, our experiences, our lived experiences, to be able to construct these knowledges, to be able to see how we can make a connection between the local and the global. And we've seen scholars writing about the need for us to recenter Africa from the periphery to the center. So these things are not just black and white. It is nuanced, and we have their power, their politics to it. And we've seen from the presentations we've made today about say what counts as say standard universities or standard way of producing knowledge, or who can actually produce this knowledge. So these are nuances. These are complexities that we have to start addressing gradually if we actually want to win the war for epistemic decolonization. And I'll just stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you for that insight. Let's go to one of our guests. We'll have Petra. Petra.
Great. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, hello. Okay, thanks a lot for a great presentation of both Dr. Freter and Dr. Abass. And as well, I really like the insightful talk of Björn, talking about, I would say it was maybe the best remark about the Western self-righteousness we are, many of us in, or at least I can hear it elsewhere, in a way how we justify the way that we are very moral and yet we behave in another way very often. And I can say myself as a white female scholar that it takes lots of time to decolonize yourself. But I wanted to bring into the discussion yet another positionality, because I am from the Czech Republic. That means Central Europe, from a country which used to be a satellite of Soviet Union for 40 years. So the very question is whether we are the center or whether we are the periphery, or where our position lies. But yet at the same time, I am a part of, let's say, very few people in my country who are trying to get back the Africana studies, which were, existent since 1960s, when they were founded on a very political ground. And yet in 2005, they ended at the Charles University in Prague, because it seems there's no more use for that. So when I decided to do I mean, I'm an art historian myself, but I take it a bit wider into things like visual studies or architecture and urban planning. And when I decided to do something about Africa myself, for example, teach about contemporary African art, I got questions starting from, why on earth do you want to talk about Africa in a country which never had colonies? Ranging all the way to, why do you want to talk about that while a white female scholar? And that's been there and that's continuing. So my question was directly for Dr. Freter, Yvette, but it may be answered by anyone. It was like, would you have any recommendations for a scholar in a country like mine, which mostly try to ignore its relationships to Africa and try to say like, it's still no useful? If you would have any recommendations, what position to take, because it's not an easy position. And at the same time, I really wanted to thank for this panel because it has been amazing and it had been so provoking and so many ideas how to go around. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Petra. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult in whatever context we are. Here in the United States, we often get the argument, our schools have de facto segregation, right? So it's not legal, but it happens. And so you have teachers that I have in my teacher education program that will very rarely have so-called minority students or students of color. So why does this matter? Why do I need to talk about issues of diversity? You know, this is going on, and there's some white woman who's obsessed with these issues of diversity, and it continues just to create trouble. Don't make trouble, don't point out. And, we literally have legislation now that has passed in our government in Tennessee, in our regional government, just recently, that if you teach critical race theory, it is illegal in the public schools. And so, the work that you're doing is really, really important in the white community, because there is a pushback. There is a rise internationally of nativism and right-wing nationalism. So what is important is a critical mindset that you're instilling in people all around you. Then I really encourage you to keep up that good fight. We live in a diversified world. People will come into contact with people of color, but if it's not just people of color, it is coming into contact with difference. And those lines are very polemical right now. And so continuing to encourage students to be able to think critically, to be able to see what it is, the othering that they are comfortable with, and to continue look at issues of positionality. If they're not race, then it is class and it's gender. And we have to keep doing that work because there is a pushback. There's this idea of that we need a second enlightenment, okay? The first enlightenment seemed to somehow create the ability that we can live with the cognitive dissonance of wanting to be good and fair and liberty and justice for all, but there's an asterisk, and that is all white men, okay? And so now the work that we do as educators on a global context is to realize that if we want to, we have to look at that asterisk. We have to look at that little reason, that caveat of how the Enlightenment initially seemed to only apply to white men and didn't apply to women or to people of color, and has continued to, I would argue, create a foundation where we are philosophically and ideologically and ethically comfortable with the inequalities that are going on in the world. And your students are going to purchase products that have been produced by people somewhere else. Every decision is one that either reinforces a neo-colonial situation or is dismantling that. And we're making those decisions every day. So well done for what you're doing, and keep on doing it, because we have to help this next generation, because there is pushback. And the second enlightenment, that hope that we had, especially some for the United States after the death of and murder of George Floyd, there was a massive movement, and now it towards the liberality that America ascribes to and ascribed to 200 years ago, and there is a literal, physical, visceral pushing back against that. It's still a real battle, and we will see that on the streets of every country throughout the world.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Freter, for that. And I also think that there will be pushback. As a scholar activist, I would say that there will be a lot of pushback even within your circle. So what you have to do is you also have to learn, find people that you, because it can be even draining physically. So you need people around that, you know, maybe not very like-minded, but people that, you know, are apologists that could participate in nurturing you so that there's energy, because we need the energy also to push forward these inclusion and equity that we're talking about. But the other part I was going to ask about the so you did mention something about it's not only, I think that it's interesting though how we think, because we live in a diverse world, hence we have to push for inclusion of ideas. But the problem also is that the ideas that we have is heavily, as both presenters presented, especially for Africa, it's very Eurocentric. So making a case within the African context that we need more voices, it seems odd, because you are in Africa, you are supposed to push for African ideas, and there shouldn't be pushback, but there is pushback.
Yeah, well, the difficulty is in the African context. I mean, if we look at developmental politics and any of this sort of stuff, I know, you know, if you ask what is good education, right? It's a British looking education or a European style education. Our universities in Africa are modeled on a liberal arts model that comes from Europe. So the problem is that Europe's become the standard, you know, the Euro-Western standard for what is good. And that buy-in is not just for European, you know, heritage people, it's for everyone. It's like, you know, if it comes from America, it's got to be great, right? You know, and it's that same mindset that there is a work for decolonization that those that have been colonizers have to do, and there's an unwanting that other, you know, people that are formerly colonized, we have to let go of. You know, we've all been indoctrinated into this meritocracy of believing that there is a better education, that there is that's the real education. And we devalue indigenous knowledge, we devalue epistemology, different ways of knowing, which is we've done beautifully against women for, you know, thousands of years. And we now have done that towards indigenous, so-called indigenous cultures. So there's an unwanting that everyone has to decide that we want to incorporate all of this knowledge. And that's why I think the desuperiorizing is a great for us, because it breaks down the hierarchy. You know, I think Augustine was talking about the inclusivity of knowledge. Everyone has been knowledge making from the beginning of time, and everyone has been educating from the beginning of time. It's not as if Africa was sitting around not making knowledge. The problem is that we somehow have philosophically created a trick of hierarchy. And that's what has to be unpacked. That desuperiorizing has to take away that hierarchy so that all of these knowledges are equally valuable and then equally able to be used for the betterment of society. But until we unpack that, until I think of my degree in South Africa is as valuable as my degree from America, we're all, you know, going to be stuck in this superioristic understanding. And that gives us the grounding to then superioristically look at peoples differently, genders differently, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Freter. You may go, Augustine.
I really love the perspective that has come up in the course of this conversation. But the question that I ask when people talk about Africa, and even authors, either African or Western authors, talking about decolonization, they need to talk about which Africa are you talking about? The Africa that was existing before it was being narrated in another way, before enslavement and colonialism, or you're talking about the Africa that is being seen from the eyes of narratives that were perpetuated from the 16th, 17th, down to the end of even colonialism, and that it's still being perpetuated. So if we begin to look at it, that the Africa you are talking about is Africa that has been at the forefront of this knowledge production, that as the Library of Alexandria, that as the Egyptian civilization and this knowledge production that people are coming all over to come and tap this knowledge, which is not a myth. We talk about Mali, we talk about Ethiopia, and then people talk about great scholars who may not even, who have a unique form of writing with scrolls and all sorts of things. And then we talk about even in the West Africa, but all this turned upside down to support a narrative that will enhance enslavement and colonialism. And when African scholars are talking about decolonization or talking about this institutional transformation, they're first of all saying, acknowledge, this Western education that you will say, okay, they want to have the Western education, or they think they have their own form of knowledge, good for them. It's wrong in itself. Acknowledge this contribution, acknowledge the foundation to this epistemic canon that you are holding. And when you acknowledge that, include the ongoing knowledge production. And I'm sorry to say that the knowledge production we have, for instance, in my own country, is a sort of state police. And who is the state? The state is owned by the former colonial master. And whatever agenda is being promoted, if a scholar is saying something that does not fit into the framework, is being questioned because the salary is coming. So you see that coming up during the time of Abacha and the invasion of the university and the silencing of courses and thinkers. And what we are looking at is, you think that the voices of the current African thinkers are being heard? No, because of the structure of the knowledge production. Do you think that the voices of the past African scholars and thinkers are still being acknowledged? No. And that is what we are talking about. It's not an activism of Black Lives Matter. It's not an activism of let them have a say about color. It's an activism that to talk about readdress the structure and readdress the built-in. And then when we talk about, for African institution, what should be done? Should it be institutional transformation? People talk about philanthropism, the idea of charity, the idea of let's go and give them this. First of all, acknowledge the injustice. And then the second thing, look at how to readdress that. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about African institutions that are in chain. And the chain is not a chain that does not have its roots. We're talking about the knowledge that we are even calling Western knowledge that does not belong to the West entirely. And that is one of the important things that I can be here and say that I'm acquiring Western knowledge to say I want to go and enlighten the people. Do you think they're not thinking? And that is the most important thing that we have to ask ourselves in our publications, in our write-ups, that we can benefit from this. We can direct the narratives in a way that presents us in a good light and that makes us to look at the good people who are making a move. Whereas the root of what we are standing on is rusty. And that's just my own contribution to that. If your Cam said that, I need to clarify that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I actually have a question with regard to, as someone asked earlier about going back. Abass did mention about the importance of collaboration, of supporting African scholars that are already on ground. And I also wonder though, because you gave us a stunning statistic that highlights the importance of why we need more PhDs on the continent. Yet you're saying that, if you're here, you can still, you can make an impact, which I see that. But as a person from a rural context, meaning myself, I grew up in a rural community in northern Nigeria. I always have this desire that, it's part of my project anyway, that it's important to educate the rural community so that we don't leave the rural community. We want to be there I want to be in my village. I feel like a human being in my village, and I've been in the diaspora for a very long time, and I've traveled to other parts of the world. The only place I feel like a human being is that space. But unfortunately, we don't have a lot. So, and part of it is some of us want to go to make an impact, so that some of us, so we can stay there, so that people like myself will go back, you know. So how can we nurture? Because sometimes even these collaborations are usually happening with people who you can have contact with. So for example, the other day I was looking for a Babalawo or Sangoma, for those in Southern Africa. I was able to make that happen because someone has the internet on the continent. Meanwhile, I have relatives that are traditional believers who can give us so much knowledge about indigenous spirituality, but I can make that happen because of lack of internet. I hope my question is not that lengthy.
I think the question of collaboration, thank you very much for your question. And Augustine and everyone that have made contribution to this conversation. I think the question of collaboration is also, it has this power dynamic or power imbalance between it and within it. And we often see people from the North trying to say, top down what is going to happen in the South and how that collaboration is going to go. So that in that we have to address the power dynamics in collaboration, and we need to humble ourselves. I think there is this humility that we have to portray when after acknowledging our positionalities, even as a Black scholar in the North. We need to understand the imbalances, or say the politics that we are navigating or we are working. So that being said, for the sake of knowledge production, I mean knowledge production in our own way that will be valid and relevant to our own realities, we need to, as I've been saying, is that we need to say kind of reinvigorate how we know, because if you see most departments in most African universities now, majority of the people they teach about are actually guys from the North. So we need to look around and think and say, okay, this is how we can create knowledge that would be useful for our people, and then that should form the basis of PhD, I mean doctoral knowledge or doctoral production or doctoral knowledge production, which is something that is lacking at the moment. For instance, while we're in university, we realize that majority of theoretical framework that we work with, say theoretical framework that are imported, and if you look at it on the long run, it's just for you to get published outside. It has no valid reality with people on ground. So we can't keep building scholars on this epistemic on this epistem. We need to look say create knowledge, and that has to do with having this very serious conversation. And I think Augustine has made case about scholars not having the voice, not having the ability to produce knowledge. I mean, the autonomy is not there, and if you're trying to do something, they have been clamping down or say a pushback from the government in many attempts to decolonize. Yeah, we know scholars have been writing about decolonization for a very long time. Chino Achebe has been writing, Wole Soyinka has been writing, and the likes of them. But how has that been, say, transformed into what we now know as knowledge today? Is it not the same thing, the same reproduction that we are having? So we have to rethink the thinking behind decolonization, especially in Africa. So the decolonization reality in Africa is quite different from the decolonization reality in the North. Yeah, the North has to decolonize, and Africa, in essence, we have to address our own decolonization with our own realities. So that will start from how we produce knowledge, or who we gatekeep, or we give the status to produce knowledge, and that will come with having PhDs or having doctoral people that can be able to do research that are needed for us to make say, make lives better for people, social mobility, development, reduce poverty, and other things that we might be facing as a continent. So it is multifaceted, but I think from our own perspective, from our own understanding of the problem, as Augustine has rightly presented, we need to understand the root of the problem, and that is the knowledge or the framework at which we are working. And so if you're able to dismantle that, if you're able to deal with that, then we can have this cross-pollination of ideas, cross-pollination of knowledge, and which will have what I would say partnership with equivalence, where we don't have say this kind of current unequal power relations that we have between the global north and the global south. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think also part of it is, which I noticed in your presentation, you cited African scholars, even though they're mostly men. I'm disappointed in that part, but at least you cite African scholars in your work. Perhaps there's an element of power in that too, because you're in the global, you're in the north, and even myself, I cite mostly African scholars, and I made that very clear to my institution that I'm not going to be citing white feminists unless they're going to be there, but as footnote. So that is good. I think that's one way we can also participate in the decolonizing process while we're in the diaspora, and also as we push forward the African voice on the continent. Thank you for that. Ute has a point she wants to make.
Maybe Kasongo can go ahead first, and then Uti can join since she's not yet. So Kasongo, please go ahead. Kasongo, you have been asked to unmute.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, thank you so much for the very interesting discussions. And I'm just going to make before I make my quick question, I just wanted to make a little comment about what Petra said. I just want to say that I lived in Russia and I speak Russian language. And also whilst there, it's just from my experience, Russian people used to tell me also that, they don't see any interest in Africa. But what I used to tell them, because I've learned that the founder of modern Russian language, actually Pushkin, I don't know, maybe Petra knows that, it's Pushkin. And Pushkin is someone of an African descent. So it's like, okay, you don't interested in Africa, but you don't know that the founder of the language you speak is not Russian, it's got African. So I used to kind of connect them with, and then I would say, oh yeah. So I'm saying that because it's very nice what you're doing, but even though having a community is always very important, because even though people may question why you have interest in that, but a community that we can form can also be helpful in inspiring other people to learn more about Africa and its history. And that to my question to the panelists is, I want to ask you, because Augustine has mentioned a point about the government not quite doing their job. We're still learning things that the colonizer have left us. And I can say something from Congo, where I am from. It's the same system the Belgians left us, we have today, which is very ridiculous, but we still have the same system. But my question is, because I think we need to focus on what we can do, whether it means forming communities, or what we can do as people or as individuals. So my question to you is, would perhaps alternative education be the solution? Because we can't just wait for government to do things for us. Will perhaps alternative education be some kind of solutions, whether it is having a community or anything, but that is not mainstream? That's my question to the panelists. Thank you.
Okay, and Yvette, we would like to go first, and I think she made mention of allies and the need for us to have allies to collaborate together to raise each other's hand up based on our positionality. So, and Abass also made mention of the fact that he's been in the West, opening up to many resources too, which are currently not in Africa, probably for historical reason and all that has happened that has messed Africa up, which he could be able to share or be able to exchange and also use to enhance others. And then I also made mention of the fact that this community spotlights scholars who are of African origin and whose publications are not being brought forward. And Yokiam made mention of the fact that being in the US, even though other people might have said what she wants to make reference to who are not of African origin, but because scholars in Africa has no one to quote them at times when they are even saying some things that are also reasonable, and she has made it clear in her work that she's going to make reference to that. And it's so important, as other people too has echoed that same idea here, that we turn where we are, we turn who we are to opportunity to uplift others who might seem to have been historically oppressed or through other conditions. And people could live on earning their living without even doing what people, other scholars who are here to give a talk, to reflect on all this are doing. They can do that. It may not even add, giving a talk or even writing along this route may not even add to the list of publication some people would like to include for their promotion. So, but they are doing it because they feel that this is the right thing to do. And these are part of the ways for institutional transformation. As Mukile said, we cannot continue to talk about the government. We know that they too may have their hands too in chains because they can't change some things. They can't even do some things. So that's why I feel that we can take Uti's question and then we can give the speakers their last words to round up all that has been said. Dr. Beck talks, Dr. Abass also talked, and then we can call it a day. So please, Uti, go ahead and we hear your voice.
Hi, everyone. My question is brief, actually, Augustine. I'm curious about, in listening, two issues stand out to me. One, the frequent recourse to African ancient, I would use that word under advisement, in quote, history as the technique for legitimization of African knowledge. So history, Alexandria, Ethiopia, Mali, all that historical route. I am wondering about the advantages, the pros and cons of that strategy. And I would like folks to comment on that. Because on the one hand, I feel that although this gives us some kind of historical legitimacy, we were here first, it also comes with the threat of always making African knowledge something ancient and past, not in sync with the contemporary. So how do we draw on these kinds of ancient, again in quote, histories in ways that inscribe their contemporary legitimacy? That is so that we don't end up playing into this fetishization of African culture and the conscribing of it into the past. That is a Western strategy. That's the first half of my question. The second is, when we say African knowledges have been sidelined, abandoned, I'm wondering whether this might be an impact of the space in which we are within the Western intellectual academic echo chamber. Because if I am from Nigeria, and I know that if there are forms of knowledge production within the Nigerian society, they have been evolved to such creative standards that people utilize very unique and creative and sophisticated ways to make sense of their daily existence because of the extreme crisis that they have to cope with. So knowledge is being produced very dynamically, very sophisticatedly, etc. However, out here within these spaces of academic interaction in the West where we find ourselves, there seems to be the assumption that knowledge is not as, forthcoming as it should be. So I guess my question is this a result of the disconnection between what we do in the Western academic space and what is actually happening on the day-to-day basis in the lives of, the average African on the continent. And if it is, how do we connect? How do we link up these two discursive sides so that we don't have this kind of conversations about transformation here, and in the end, the profits or whatever, the benefits that derive from them just surface on the cycle on the surface and don't really sink down to have tangible real life implications and benefits. Those are my questions.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
That's
okay, thank you.
Is I'm me, Augustine? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was just trying to thank him for the question and the comment that's also from the chat with regards to the question. And I would like to ask if there are more questions before we do what we plan to do, to have the speakers, the guest speakers, hear the last voices. There's only, Jim Parry's said that's a legitimate question that is facing a lot of people that has been asked by Uti. So I think we take it one after the other now. Yvette can go first to take response and to round up all is a reaction to all that has transpired in the course of today's conversation, as well as responding to Uti's concern.
Uti asked, makes really profound, insights. And I think Kai Horstman is a researcher that I refer to in this, and he has done interesting work in trying to move beyond the romanticizing of a past, which is often done when there's a reclamation work done with Indigenous work. It's the same thing that happens in the United States. It's this sort of romanticized view of the Native American, and you have the good old days of cultures where we try and reclaim that. We had the movement in the 60s here in the United States of the sort of Afrocentrism, and that continues to leave Indigenous people in their pasts, right? Instead of making it relevant for today. And so Horstman's argument is a very pragmatic one. He suggests a curriculum that is addressing contemporary issues. And that's how, these very real challenges of poverty, of life throughout the world. This is not, this is no longer just Africa's problem. But addressing, having philosophy and academia address the issues of the time to be relevant for students, and that education is actually part of a social improvement. And so Horstman talks, because he doesn't just want representation, right? Just to cite, right? Of course, we're very, women scholars, we always try and cite other women. African scholars are always trying to cite other Africans, which is very good, but it's more than just making sure there's people in the bibliography. It's, and we want to avoid people charging us with reverse discrimination, right? Because then that wastes everybody's time. If we just say, it's just reverse racism, right? So what he said, and then of course there are liabilities in every culture. So the good old days, everyone's got things that were not great in the good old days. That's the unique, universal human experience. And so he, and then also the mindsets that have come out of coloniality, like deprivation mindsets, victimization, all of these traumas that have been put on people. So to avoid all of those challenges, he suggests a sort of an Afro-realism, which I mentioned before. And it's a pragmatic, what he seeks to do is link the institution with solving the problems of the society where the institution is based, and that the thinking of the people there should be towards solving the problems of where they are, and that creates relevance and contextualization and energy to the work that is done. So I hope that answers the question, but that connecting academia to the reconstruction. Yes, reclamation, but then also new knowledge production. I will create, contributions to community that will solve problems in a so-called post-colonial era. I hope that, and so my final thoughts, just let's keep on doing the work, and thank you so much for this forum. It's a great place to be together.
Thank you so much. And then Abass can come in with that now.
Thank you very much for your question, and Oti, Kile, and everyone that have made contribution to this conversation. I think you've made very valid and very important questions that we have to address, especially when we are having this discussion of transformation. Transform who and what are we transforming? So, to just make reference to the importance of history and how history has conferred prestige onto universities. The leading universities of today were not universities created in the last 100 years. They were universities that have been around for centuries, and that shows that there is an emphasis on the history of knowledge production, and we have to be able to make that link between the past and the present. So history is kind of a prologue into current situation, and that's why I was trying to make reference to those institutions that have existed, to those canons that we've had, but due to the encounter and everything that happened in the 18th, 19th century and where we are today. So as far as the institution is concerned, they've been very instrumental in the progress or in the development of the world generally, and even in Africa's development. But we have to make reference to how how institutions in Africa have been crippled due to external circumstances, which I would say, and that was the structural adjustment program that happened in the 80s, and that is why we are unable to deliver what is expected in terms of education or development for the continent that harbors these institutions. So we are trying to address the failure of these institutions in living up to the reality of why they were created in the first place. Why were they created in the first place? They were created for the colonialists. So we have to create our own institutions for our people. But people have been asking that, why do we say that the tool belonged to the masters in the first place? Who said the masters were the owner of the tools? What if the tools were actually the property of the slaves, as Augustine was trying to echo in the conversation about who has the tools and how do we use that tool to dismantle the house? So beyond dismantling, beyond the master's tool, I think we need to look at the current realities of people that we are, say, theorizing or having this conversation on or with, and how this discussion would affect their life personally, even their daily activities. And that would lead me to conclude on the need for alternative education that Mukile was pushing forward. And we've actually forgotten that we have knowledges in our communities, but because they do not fit into these categories of what we regard as knowledge, then they've been pushed to the periphery of knowledge production. So we need to bring them back into the university. We need to establish this link between the gown and the town to make sure that the logics are working together for the development of the community. So the university would have to stop being the ivory tower. It have to stop being or working in isolation. It has to work with communities that is hosting them. We have to humble the university. And in that case, the university must realize that there are legitimate knowledges surrounding the university, and working together would, as we've seen in non-formal or informal education system that we have in Nigeria, and people have been living or making lives on this. So it is about making this connection, trying to make this connection that every knowledge is legitimate and they can actually make contribution to our development as a nation or as a continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I thank all the speakers and all the people who have been asking questions. And I know that Yokiam, the co-host, is a very scholar with a lot of spontaneous ideas. So I will not just give the last round of discussion without knowing that she's okay with that and she has something to say to before we now take the concluding rights, do the concluding rights. Yokiam, please.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm not gonna say much because there's always something to say. I just wanted to say that also, if you're in the West, the other part of research that I think some of us may not be leaning towards as people of African descent or Africans in the diaspora is we could be looking at actually work of other Africans. What I mean by other Africans, I'm people of African descent. Okay, and their work, for example, be it in Brazil, Afro-Brazilians, be it in Cuba, Afro-Cubans, be it in the United States, African-Americans, you can look at their research. Some of them actually do work on Africa. This is directly, I'm responding to Uti's question. Some of them are already doing work. They're highlighting the past, and they're also bringing in the present in their work as a way for them to liberate themselves within their context. So maybe not to subscribe a solution for the continent, but they're using Africa as an inspiration. So even the idea of essentialism, of romatizing Africa, Europeans romatize Europe on a regular basis, every day. So what are we talking about? They do that on a regular basis. So that idea of romatizing Africa, of course, we have to draw from the past on a regular basis as Africans. That's part of who we are and our worldview, generally speaking.
Yeah.
But also, we're living the current reality. So we use that to push us forward. That's where I'm going to stop. Thank you so much for your time. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Yokiam. And the theme for this deliberation is actually African institutions, issues, trends, and perspectives. And one of the things raised by Uti is actually fundamental, because African scholars, like Dr. Jim also said, that's a good question that a lot of people are divided. You're divided between publishing a work that join the current conversation in other parts of the world, in Finland, in US, or addressing issues that are priority to you people. And a lot of scholars of African origin knows that this is a rediscovery period for us, a recovery period, a period to bring up ideas that are original, and that in philosophy, in art, in mathematics, in medicine, in architectures, and to make reference to their original roots and African. But they tell young scholars who are of African descent that you stop romanticizing the past. But when I want to make a philosophy paper, I have to follow the canon, make reference in phenomenology back to Heidegger, even before talking about post-phenomenology of Donheit. I have to talk. So most of all this internalization, and we have to also know that knowledge production also has a form of priority. Why the issue of LGTB is so fundamental and important in the West is not a priority. They are talking about governance. They're talking about developing certain framework that will make children to understand mathematics and be able to compete in the world based on the traditional or the previous ones that were being subjected or dragged into oblivion. So we know we are in the period of rediscovery, and we those who want to join the trend, join the trend. Those who want to insult their father's heritage, insult. But the truth is this, that the scholarship has gone to a level of the present academic atmosphere that we have. Your originality depends on whether you have the data or whether you are connected to what you are talking about. So African scholars who have refused to go back to the root as well as take pride in the originality of works that have been existing that have African roots will not have anything to say than to parrot or to just be the agents that has been made to parrot what others are saying. Because I can't claim authority in Heidegger, because I can't even read the original work written by Heidegger because I don't know German. Neither can I start claiming authority in Shakespeare. But the truth is I can claim authority in Ifa corpus. I can claim authority, but you begin to tell me I'm romanticizing in the past. So the most important thing is this desensitization and mental reorientation is fundamental, that we don't even oppress ourselves. So we thank all our allies, if we are allowed to call the allies, because I know Freter always talk about allies, yeah. And then we thank all the forerunning scholars, we thank Abass, and we know that we are not part of activism that try to bring black and white contrast, that try to bring all sorts of things to muggle things up.
we are scholars and we remain that, and we continue our conversation. We are having a presentation by Bujon and Abba and Dr. Shabazz on the questions of the superiority of race, superiority and inferiority of race. And then the August, we're going to have a very interesting session on the difference between Western and African feminism. And so we begin to realize that this network itself is an embodiment of this objective we have set before us. So wishing you a great day, and we distribute the videos. We're going to compress it that all over Africa, and we're going to layer it with other voices all over Africa. They're going to watch this, even if they can't stream online and watch this. Thank you and have a great day. On behalf of all the teams and the committees, well, thank you and round of applause for everyone. Have a great day and bye. Yeah.